recording on the session. Sorry. And thanks to our facilitator who's helping us today. Okay, so last class we were talking about revenue forecasting, right? And I'm gonna drill today into a little bit more of that and a little specific issues that you are probably gonna observe in some of these specific industries, right? That it may be helpful to discuss quickly in this modeling seminar, right? So let me open first, if I can figure it out where we are. Here it is. Okay, so we were discussing this analysis, right, that we performed last time regarding revenues. And this is a very simple model, right, that we are kind of familiar with, where you are going to analyze or try to forecast the revenue based on a top-down or a bottom-up methodology. Nothing too complicated over there, right? We have discussed that in order to correctly forecast this case, the revenues of Volcan, right, which is a mining company, right, we had two alternatives that are very quickly. Either we focus on a top-down approach, right, where we try to forecast the total revenue that the company is going to have based on some estimate of the growth for our economy or for particularly the growth for the mining sector, right? That was a possibility. We also analyzed that we should consider what's going to be happening in each one of the different quarters when analyzing how we're going to distribute this information into the future, right? What we said here is that there's also an alternative approach logically that is going from a bottom up. And if you have time, right? If you are not pressed to come up with a quick result, I always would suggest to go with a bottom up approach because it will allow you to have a better estimate, right? So a top down is basically an approach that you should attempt to do where you are doing a rough analysis and if you do not have time to do that. So in the bottom up, right, you will have some information of quantities and prices, right, that are going to allow you to come up with a better estimate of what's going to be the revenues for this particular company or that we can estimate into the future, right, for the coming quarters and logically for the coming years. So for the coming year that we're going to be having, right? And the key issue, obviously, is to try to figure out what's going to be the qualities that we're going to be having of a particular product in order to come up with this estimation that we are talking about right now. So this is a fairly simple analysis, right, that you would probably have performed in other scenarios. Let me jump into something a little more difficult that is already on Blackboard, right? Which is the case that you do not have a simple price times quantity calculation, but instead of that, you're going to have something more in the sense of subscription approach or subscription business, right? Where you're going to have recurring revenues in general as part of your income and at all. So let me just quickly change our screen. So I'm going to open a file that is already on Blackboard, right? Which I have called um, recurring revenues or revenue. Let me just quickly verify that. What's the name that I put here? Yes. That's a recurrent revenue model that is already in Blackboard. And I'm going to be sharing that model. Okay, so in this particular case, I'm presenting information of a telecom company, right? You can imagine that this is a mobile company or an internet company or something like that. But this type of analysis is going to be very similar if you think about a subscription-based approach on the sense of magazines, newspapers, right? Even if you think about Dropbox or Amazon Prime, right, where you have this structure where the revenues are mainly coming, or a significant portion of revenues are coming from subscriptors, right? Your clients become revenue generators in the sense that they pay a monthly fee, right, as part of the whole structure. So in this particular case, right, I think I missed one of my assumptions. We're going to be talking about a company, right, that's going to have a certain amount of recurring revenues, and I'm forecasted from year 2021 onwards, right? I have some information, historical data for year 2020, and I have assumed certain numbers for sales, right, for simplicity purpose. This, if you want to drill a little bit more on the model that I use or that I prepared a while ago, right? It's basically going to be the number of customers, right, times the price that you're offering these services. Nothing more complicated than that in general. But the key issue that I wanted to highlight, and I think I missed that on my assumption, let me just put it here, right, is that it takes 2 months that to start collecting, right? So in this particular case, as I mentioned, it's a telecom company, right? And even if you have a client, in this case, it's not a company, it's going to take some time for the telecom company to get everything settled, right? So that's why you have a backlog in general, right, of prior clients, right, that you have not served so far. A backlog, by the way, it's all the amount of projects, right, that you have, or the number or amount in dollars and soles of projects that you have, right, that you are going to have to deliver in the coming months, right, as part of the whole structure that you have. In this particular case, what I have assumed is that, okay, we're going to have some sales, right, that are going to be generating recurring revenues. And those sales are only going to be generating revenues 2 months after we start, right? Offering this. Let me just increase a little bit the zoom. Just realizing it looks very small. It's already in Blackboard. You want to check about it. I put some information on the recurring revenues number that we should start with, right? And I mentioned that there's a potential backlog, right? So it means that there were some customers that you do not serve in time and that you are going to be at serving those customers, right, and receiving the revenue from those customers in the coming months as part of that. Okay, let me jump into the next step. Right, realize that I have realigned this uh, a little bit different, or I just move basically the information that it's on an annual perspective on front instead of at the end, right? It can be either way in general in this approach. And I'm also using our typical structure that I was a SAMIF, right, to get everything settled here, right? And I also keeping some rows and columns, right, just in case we need to do some additional analysis going forward. But in this particular case, what we meant is this information on sales, right, that I have been analyzing and assuming, right, for the coming months. The thing that I wanted to highlight, right, is that when you are talking about a recurring revenue company, right, it's not as simple as price time quantity, right? It's not as simple as, okay, how many customers do I have today, right, times the quantity that I'm going to be getting. Because if you just analyze that, right, you are probably going to be missing the operational effects, right, that are coming out of the recurrent revenues, right, the delay that may take place because you're going to take some time to get the customers on board, to get everything settled for the customers. Once again, this is a telecom company that was going to uh, spend some time, right, preparing all the equipment for the customers, right? If I want to get a little bit more detail, imagine that this is a company that is offering an internet service, right, with a very specific model for corporate customers, right? So you have to go into the customer office, into your customer database or data center, better said, and with them work it out all the necessary layout in order to have the services being offered, right? But most importantly, one of the things that is usually missed when you just think about price times quality, right? Which once again, it's a typical thing for all most companies, right? One of the things that you usually miss when you are thinking about recurring revenues is that there is this concept called churn, right? So churn is basically all the revenues that you are going to be missing, right? That you are going to be not receiving due to the fact that the customers are defecting, that the customers are leaving your company as part of a normal process. So technology companies, telecom companies are one of the most common companies to have a high level of churn, right? Particularly mobile companies, right, as you may have realized, have a lot of churn due to number portability, right? That capacity of customers to change from one company to the other, taking their own number, have increased significantly churn in this type of companies. Uh, so in a subscription-based approach, right, a churn number should be included as part of your typical estimation. In this particular case, I can make a quick assumption here, right, that you can realize of 0.3% churn, right, in each one of these different months. And the churn is usually a percentage, right, of the revenues that you are going to be getting at the beginning of the period. So this creates a flow, right, with an initial recurring revenue and a final recurring revenue, where you add some additional revenue and lose another revenue due to churn as part of the structure. 1 minute. Sorry. So coming back here, uh, as I was saying, right, and we can quickly go over this structure, right? The correct way to estimate a recurring revenue implies that you think about this in an initial and final approach where you add all the elements necessary in order to figure that out, right? And the only difficult that you are going to be having in this typical structure, right, is that the recurring revenues in this particular case, right, due to the assumption on this particular telecom company, right, is that it takes 2 months for every sale that is made to materialize as revenue, right? And this is something that is usual, right, in telecom companies and in other type of companies as well, right? Subscription-based companies such as magazine usually takes 1 month for everything to be settled, right, in order to start producing. I have also made an assumption about the backlog, right? And by the way, when we talk about backlog, this is not only something typical of recurring revenue companies, right? You can also have a typical backlog in construction, right, or engineering companies. Basically, when you analyze one of those companies, right, the backlog is very important. It's not only important how many projects they are involved in, but also important, okay, what projects do you have in order to be deployed in the coming months or years, right? So in this case, the backlog means that the company was delayed in deploying the services to the customers, right? So I make an assumption about how the backlog is going to be deployed in the coming months, right? How easily it's going to be to the company to just get this done. Logically, this information needs to be contrasted with the managers, right? And you're probably going to have to come up with a better estimation, figure out what's going to be the backlog in the coming months, right, for this particular period. Um, Coming back here, right, with the churn, we are going to come up with the current revenues, and that's how you typically going to be capable of forecasting this, right, in all these other months. And logically, oh, there's a question. Sorry. Yes, Rodrigo.
Yeah, teacher. I'm sorry, but I don't understand why on January there's like an initial recurring revenue. Shouldn't it be zero?
Oh, yeah. So what I'm assuming, let me just get back to the Excel. Sorry, since I'm jumping from pages. No, so I'm assuming that the company, it's an ongoing company, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
not a new company. The company has already been operating on time, right? Has sales for the past years,
Oh.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
there should be a recurring revenue that is obviously an assumption here, right? that is coming out of the financial statements, right? There should be that information available that it's going to help you come up with that. So if we let me just quickly jump into Telefonica, what I have it right over here. Telefonica financial statements, right? Let me just quickly open that up. So you just have that information just available at all, right? Just
Yeah, but I thought that the revenue was like a flow instead of an stock. So I don't get why you are adding it up all those years.
yeah. So yeah, thanks exactly for that question. It's exactly the point that I wanted to raise. So this is a critical thing, right? Normally we think of revenue as a flow, right? Yes, it's for all our analysis. Usually we think, okay, revenue is a flow. You have the revenue, and the revenue of last month, right, doesn't have anything to do with the revenue of this month, and so on, right? We normally think that way. That's the typical way we are accustomed to work. What I wanted to highlight when talking about recurring revenues is that this is the exception to that rule, where the revenue of last month, right, actually impacts the revenue that you're going to have this month because it is adding, right? It's going to be it's going to be something that you're going to be keeping on time. So let me quickly go over here and probably think about from an operational standpoint, right? Sorry, let me see if I'm showing correctly the presentation. Yes, I'm still here. Right, from an operational standpoint, and it's actually usually from a forecast standpoint, it's usually simple to think about revenue, right? What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to quickly make an assumption about price, right? I'm going to assume it constant, and we're going to see it in subscriber terms, right? And logically, when you think about subscriber terms, then you realize, oh, yes, the number of subscribers is going to be changing, right? And that's the values that I'm observing right now. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to make an assumption about price, right? Let me just quickly make an assumption. Let me quickly make 100, right? This is just a quick and dirty example of some of that. Let me do something else since this is moving. I want to have this. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to make a quick and dirty assumption about price, right? I did it wrong. Mistake here. Should be right there. Okay, that's us. So from operational standpoint, and you think about subscribers, right? You're going to have an initial subscriber base. Let's quickly get to the correct number. This is the initial one, right? So these are, let me forget about the decimals a minute, right? Logically, the price times the quantity of subscribers should give you the total revenues, right? So you have an initial number of subscribers, right? What we're saying is we're going to be adding, right, new subscribers, right? Those additional recurring revenue. It's jumping on me. Code that. Okay. So we are thinking about these are the total number of subscribers, right? So there are new subscribers, right? That's 568. There's a backlog of subscribers, so people who we didn't serve in time. Those are new subscribers as well. And there are some people who we're going to be losing, some lost subscribers. So you get the subscriber final number, right? And this is the time skew that we are usually talking about, right? The problem is this, right? When you are working and trying to analyze this information, is honestly kind of difficult to come up with this number of subscribers from outside the company, right? In general, you try to focus on the revenue more than in the operational side. So logically, this is the price times Q that you want to come up, right? This is the total number that we have here on top. Let me just quickly do a check, right? Typical check, and it's gonna be true, right? But what I wanted to highlight is that yes, the number of subscribers that I have final, right, is gonna impact in the other number of subscribers, right? And if you want to forecast this correctly, right, you need to think about, okay, what's gonna be the number of subscribers that I'm gonna be having? Let's divide this times price, right? In this, the new subscribers that I'm going to have in this month, right? And what is the backlog of subscribers that I'm going to be having? And what is the churn of subscribers that I should expect to have, right? It was 0.3% that I will expect to have. There's a minus over here that I'm missing in order to come up with a new number of subscribers. And true, right? You're going to be, if you multiply this times price, right? And I'm assuming price constant, that's another complication that you need to figure it out. You are going to be getting the number that we have on top, right? So if we move into the operational side, right, it's pretty obvious that we are trying to figure out what is the total final number of subscribers, right? So if we are going to be forecasting this into the future, right, from an operational standpoint, it's not going to be as simple, right, as imagine that these numbers are going to be growing at a certain rate, right? It's not going to be that simple in general. Why? Because sales do change through time, right? This information, the one that I have here on top, the one that is the assumption, right? That's the critical data that you may have access to, right? That information comes from your commercial side of the business, and you are going to be capable of figuring out what's going to be the future sales you're going to be getting, right? The problem is sales does not equal in a subscriber-based company. Sales are not equal revenue. Sales equal additional revenue that you're going to have, right? And in this particular case, sales imply additional new subscribers that you're going to have. Even with the backlog right here, that it actually disappeared completely. Here, there we go. And you're going to be getting some subscribers that are going to be getting out of your company, right? Reducing the total number. So the reason I wanted to highlight this type of forecasting for recurring revenue is that you do not think about revenue as a flow in this particular type of companies, right? Because the sales that you are getting or that you are generating, right, are not directly or does not mean the total revenue you have, right? On a subscriber-based company, right, that implies that there's additional revenue that you are going to be getting here, the 70,000, right? So, and eventually, right, you are going to be getting the total number, right? That's what I wanted to highlight here. I hope I made myself clear on this. Yes, no, maybe. Yes, I guess yes. Okay. Okay, thank you. And then also confirms that everybody can hear me well, which is something that I didn't ask at the beginning. Okay, so let me save this on here, right? And I wanted to, one minute, loading this. I'm gonna be uploading, let's quickly go over here. Where is it? Here it is. It's losing you for a minute. Okay, I'm uploading another file right now into Blackboard on one bit of a second.
Profe, creo que su micro está apagado, porque no me sale el icono de que está hablando.
Thanks. That was silly on me. Okay. Coming back. Let me rephrase from and get back onto that mishap. I should have taken more medicine than I expected to to make that mistake. Okay. So coming back here, we are. What I'm saying is that I'm presenting right the financial statements right of a company that is in the education sector, right? This particular company has schools for college students, for obviously teenagers and so on. It has academies, which are prep schools, as you know them. And there's also some printing subsidiary, right, at what is called Ediciones over there, where they prepare some documentation, obviously, for either the classes in the schools and on the academies. That's a typical thing, right? What I wanted to do right now, right, since I'm struggling with some of the issues over here, is to go through some of the typical expenses you are going to be facing off, right, when analyzing one of the service company, right? This will be a service company. Quickly discuss with you, right? Um, what are the main issues when you go with a top-down or bottom-up approach in this structure, right? So the top-down approach you are very familiar with, right? You usually should come up with some estimation of the gross margin, right? And you are going to try to estimate an EBIT margin in order to come up with what should be the profitability of the company in the future, right? That's a typical way you are mostly familiar with, right? And probably, sorry, this should be actually, we should start with historical data. I made probably a wrong link here, and I think I actually hard coded the numbers, which was silly on my part. Uh, you should start with the historical numbers to come up with the data, right? But that, let me just quickly simplify this as normal as you will do. I do have it right over here, and we're going to be getting this value. Sorry about that. That's a mishap on my part. It should be historical data where we start the analysis, right? A part of the usual one. And this is the sum that we are familiar with, and everything else is coming, right? What I wanted, as we are going to be, I'm going to continue doing this very quickly, and I'm going to save it. Don't worry about that. On your end, well, you can do it very quickly here. As you can realize, some of the expenses are the most familiar with, right? And first of all, the most important expense that you are going to be observing in mostly all the companies, right, is personnel expenses, right? If you observe a company that does not have a significant personnel expenses, usually it's a company that it's outsourcing most of its operations, right? But keep an eye on that. It's usually in the past, right? When you have observed those type of companies, there's some shady business going on, or some potential problem for the company in the sense of a contingency from the labor authority. Okay, finally, I did it. I did it quickly, right? So once again, let me just quickly go over this, right? As I was saying, the most important, right, of the typical expenses that you are going to observe, right, is the personnel expenses, right? And then you will have several expenses that are related usually to the PP&E, property, plant, and equipment, right? In this particular case, given that the fact that this company is in the education sector, a significant portion of its expenses are going to pay rent, right? As part of the whole structure that they have. They usually rent their facilities, right? Um, it's if you want to make an analogy, by the way, and think about, for instance, as Innova Schools, in contrast to this company that is renting its facilities, right? Innova School is a education company, school that has decided to own its own facilities, right? And if we analyze the information that they have presented into the market, they have basically issued bonds in order to get the necessary financing to purchase all those facilities that we are talking about, right? Uh, so in that case, for instance, if we think about it for Innova School, you're going to observe that it's not rent. The main item is going to be depreciation, right? The main issue that you are going to be considering when analyzing that type of company. Let me get back in here. Okay. So the other items that it's important here in this education type of company, it's obviously taxes, right? And I wanted to highlight some issue that usually happen with education companies and with some other non-for-profit companies. It's the fact that they do not charge um, IGB, right, as part of their revenues. So all education companies do not have IVA or additional VAT, value-added taxes, right? And in that case, the IGB or value-added tax becomes an expense, right? You're not going to see that in most companies as part of their taxes. Most companies do compensate the value-added taxes, the IGB that they have in expenses, with the value-added taxes IGB that they have in their revenues. When they issue a bill, they do compensate that, and logically the VAT, the IGB, does not appear right in their income statements. The issue with education companies, right, is that they cannot compensate the VAT, right? They cannot compensate the IGB since they do not have any positive IGB coming from the bills that they issue, right? The receipt that they have, so that's why it becomes a tax over here. Logically, there's other taxes as part of the typical structure that we're going to see. And I have highlighted everything as part of suppliers, right? I have aggregated here suppliers that they may provide services for the school, right? And logically, that should not include personnel. One key item that I wanted to highlight here in this structure, right? You do realize that I'm not using the typical income statement structure where you're gonna have um, cost of sales, right, and SG&A. I hope that, and in some cases, it's more clear to opt to a structure where you're gonna have all the operational profits and all the operational revenue. Sorry, that was a misspelling, and all the operational expenses, right? It's more easy to figure that out in order to come out with a correct estimation of the operational part of the company. What we are going to be having here in personnel that I wanted to highlight, let me just translate it to English, right? You're only going to be salaries here. You're also going to have obviously bonus, and let me put it here, stock compensation, right? And what I wanted to highlight is when you are typically analyzing a financial statement, remember that in Peru, there's a line at the bottom, right, that is related to not only income tax, right, but also related to uh, utilidad para los trabajadores, so workers' share of the total income or profit that the company is having, right? And that total share of profit, right, to the workers should be considered as part of the typical compensation, right, salary compensation for the workers. When you do the forecasting, right? And that's a typical mistake when you are preparing financial statements, right? Or actually forecasting of free cash flow. People normally do not consider that line that is going to be generating additional costs, right, over the EBIT line as part of that estimation. Okay, so coming back on here, right, as we were saying, this is the structure as a percentage of cost, right? But when you are going to be analyzing this from a vertical approach, right, you need to get this as a percentage of revenues, right? And I'm going to also think about all the costs that we're going to be having and how these different costs, right, are going to be evolving in time, or what we're going to be assuming that they evolve in time, right, in a bit, right? So if we think about this in this sense, right, let me just quickly do this. From a revenue standpoint, right, all the schools are providing more than half of the revenue for the company, right? But what I wanted to highlight on a cost perspective, right, is that in a vertical approach, right, uh, most of the revenue, right, is being consumed by the personnel expenses being the highest one. And, and if we want to do a top-down approach, right, the easiest way, obviously, is to just assume something about this forecast in the future, right? So let me just put it here this way. This is going to be percentage of revenue. This is going to be 2020, right? And if we want to do the forecast for the coming years, right? What basically can be estimated. Let me just insert a row over here just to make it more clear. Can be estimated, right? Is to do a quick calculation, quick assumption, right, regarding this percentage into the future, right? And logically, what you will expect is that there's some improvement in the company in order to consider some additional productivity and some additional profit for the company, right? So normally when you go ahead, you discuss this obviously with the managers of the company, right, in order to come up with the correct forecasting. I'm only going to do 3 years of forecasting here. Happened over there. Should be this plus one. It should be 2020, right? And logically, you make some assumption about this, just that the company is going to be a little more efficient, right? Reducing some part of the labor force, or the labor force is capable of producing more over time, right? And you make an assumption that this percentage becomes a little more stable over time somehow, right? Let me just think about it, that it decreased to 35% as a whole. But you are capable of doing that uh, reduction in costs, right? What normally will happen, for instance, if you are analyzing a company that is usually in trouble, right? And let me point it out, because this is evidently going to happen in the next months, right? Given the current situation that we are facing, there's going to be a lot a lot of companies, right, that are going to have to cut a lot more personnel, even if they have already not cut enough, right? So there have been several layouts in some companies. We do know about that. There's a lot of shifting going on, and the easiest way to reduce recurring costs, right, and the most important recurring cost is personnel, right? So one of the things that you're going to observe in most companies that are going through this process of financial illiquidity, right, or financial distress, what they are going to be doing is reducing the number of workers that are not adding value, right? Um, even if we are not in this situation, right? Even if we're not facing a recession, right? You will observe that several companies have a lot of overhead, a lot of expenses on personnel, right? That are mostly on the administrative side, not generating significant profitability for their services, right? I don't mean that they are not working. They may be working, right? But the job they are performing and the product that they are bringing to the company is not adding enough value. So if you find a company that has a liquidity shortage, if the company that is having some trouble, uh, the first item you should look into obviously is the personal line, right? And figure out which workers are not essential and can be cut off without affecting significantly the profit generation process of that particular company. So that's why normally when we forecast this, right, we basically assume that we are going to be capable of being a lot more productive, right? This does not necessarily mean that I'm firing anybody, right? 40 to 35%. It may actually mean that we are capable of generating this higher amount of revenue with the same people, right? That means that are becoming a lot more productive, right? Uh, Regarding rent, I'm going to make some assumptions here, but let's make them sensible, right? Let's discuss it a little bit. I'm just not going to put the number by putting that, right? If you think about rent for a minute, and we are talking once again about a school, a company that is in education system, right? A company that has schools and that has academies, right? Obviously, in order to be capable of providing a lot more revenue, right? You need to expand this company. You need to get a lot more facilities, right? In order to be capable of providing a lot more services to new customers. So I'm going to assume that it's constant, right, through time, just for the sake that it's going to be growing at the same rate of revenue. Realize that by assuming constant, right, I'm going to put it here and save it later. It means that it grows or it changes at the same rate of revenue. So I'm basically saying that we're making assuming, right, that this goes at the same way of the whole revenue that we're going to be getting, that we're going to need to expand our facilities, right, that we're going to need pay more, right, in rent in order to be capable of getting that additional revenue, right? Uh, I'm going to make an assumption here about, this is, honestly, I don't know how to say that in English. This is municipality taxes, right? And property taxes. Okay, I figured out. I'm also going to assume that it goes with the same way, right? Assuming that it goes with the revenue. And also going to assume that for taxes, right? But not for these guys, right? Our friends that are on director's line, right? You should actually nail that out, right? And come up with the correct calculation. And just assume, okay, I'm going to assume that it's going to be diluted because you're not going to get a lot more directors right into the board of directors just for the fact that you are growing, right? As part of that. Uh, so in this particular case, I'm just going to make an assumption here, and we're gonna go into that in a bit, right? How we're going to figure that out better. It should be 0.1% and negative. Okay, and I'm just gonna assume that this drops to this number very quickly, right? 0.5. Okay, that's just an assumption that we can figure out. Okay. Uh, Regarding utilities, that's what service of públicos mean. That usually mean we're going to be paying for light, for electricity. You're going to be paying for water and everything that goes with that. I'm going to once again assume that it's constant. That's part of our estimation. Fixed funds, that's a fixed amount, right, in our forecast, right? It's better if we do not. Let me just do this, guys, to make it better. So I'm not going to forecast this way. I'm also going to change this. It's actually better to do it this way. And we're going to do the forecast and the total amount, right? Suppliers, let's make an assumption that you are capable of producing a lot more. With reducing the number of suppliers, we're going to just make an assumption here regarding that this drops to 11%, right? And I'm gonna make it delay or reduce over here over time, right? Okay, so I just wanted to draw those assumptions very quickly, just for the sake of coming up with a nice number. And insurance, let me just assume that it goes along with the revenue as part of our estimation, right? And why do I leave this here in yellow is because when we are going to be doing the whole forecasting thing, right, of the expenses from a top-down approach, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat just the number. So it's asking me to reboot the computer. Hope it doesn't reboot itself. We are going to be doing here a quick and dirty top and down analysis, right, before moving into the bottom up analysis that we have on the other tab, right? Uh, so coming back here, sorry, what we're going to be having here, right, from a revenue standpoint, I'm going to be using the data that I already have, right, on the other tab, right? I have forecasted some revenues in general. So let me jump over here a bit and pick it up, the revenue forecasting tab, in order to come up with the numbers that we are talking about, right? Okay, so this is fairly simple, right? In reality, just gonna quickly put this here. You can actually build something. Yeah, that's it. There we go. Yeah, let's check that it's working properly. Yeah. So in order to come up with this, right, I just wanted to highlight this here, right? And as we said, I'm missing a minus. I put a minus on top. It should be left. Right, this is very quick and dirty top-down analysis, right? As I was saying, since this is fixed, right? Let me just quick back here. These are the board of directors fees, right? And also the fixed funds that you usually have in a particular company, right? And I'm assuming that these numbers are going to continue to be fixed, and that's how you forecast, obviously, the expenses at all that we are going to be having here, right? Let's quickly go over here. That's fairly easy, right? That's not going to be a complication for you in general, right? What I wanted to discuss with you today is mostly this part, right? How do you figure it out? Okay, which are the key elements that you need to think about, right, when forecasting a company's expenses, right? And these are the most typical type of expenses on a service company, right? In order to provide the necessary revenue that we are forecasting over here. Sorry, that's taking me a little bit more. Give me one. So I guess it's kind of fortunate that these things are virtual, because if I was this sick, obviously I probably wouldn't be at the university for in class. I mean, at the university, because for fear of getting anybody sick, right? Okay. let's jump onto the other tab, right, for a minute, and let's quickly analyze what I have prepared here for forecasting purposes, right? And what I wanted to start here, which is an approach that it's a lot more detailed than the typical one that we are going to be having, right? It's that there are several variables to consider when analyzing this structure, right? The first one, evidently, is when we are forecasting this, and I have made some assumptions that you can quickly analyze. It's that in order to come up with the revenues for this particular company, right? A couple of the assumptions have been what are the changes that you expect to occur in prices, right, over time, and what are the changes that you expect to occur in students, right? In general, right, as part of our normal estimation that you are going to be seeing. And logically, when I have been analyzing this structure, right, uh, there are some assumption regarding how revenue is gonna be arriving to this particular um, company, this educational company, right? Over time, usually, in this particular case, this estimation in revenue has been considering a cash flow perspective, right? So January is a month where you still have an important revenue, right? Because usually parents take some time to pay the tuition fees, in particular in schools. So you probably know that according to some regulation in the Ministry of Economy, no, sorry, in Education, right? Students cannot be denied classes or tests, right? Even if parents are behind on paying the tuition to the school, right? Um, so normally what will happen is that in the last month of the year, right, and in the first months of the new year, you get some parents that do a catch up, right, regarding their tuition fees, right? And the reason they do it in December and January, obviously, it's because that there is a double salary that usually gets paid, right? And in February and March, they do pay additional fees from last year, right? The tuition fees from last year because you need to uh, put the student or register the student, right, into the next year, right? That's part of the whole structure. Since the school year is coming, they need to get uh, get back on track, repaying all the past due accounts that they have. So as you can see on the Excel, one of the key issues obviously here, right, is that, and we are considering a growth rate, this obviously is an assumption, right? But it's obviously thinking or analyzing it compared to last year month number, right? As part of the estimation. And that's the typical way, right? You're going to have annual growth rate, right, that compared year over year. And the reason we do that, as we discussed last class, right, well, the class that we have 2 weeks ago, right, is the fact that there's seasonality, right, in your revenues. So it's a good idea to have an annual rate that compares to the same revenue, but from last year, the same months. I explained incorrectly. Let me rephrase what I said. It's you need to compare today's revenue or this month's revenue against the revenue you have in the same month but in the prior year, right? This thing is a little bit off. Okay, so coming back here, right, there's some assumptions that has been made here, as you can realize. there's a growth rate estimated in the prices and a growth estimated in number of students, right? There's some assumption also in this particular case where we assume that there's not going to be any more growth in number of students, and everything is going to be based on prices, right? In this particular scenario, what it has been assumed, right, is that they were not going to be opening any more facilities, and they were reaching the maximum number of students that they had as part of the operational side of the business, right? There's no any more room for students in the classrooms, right? Given the fact that they have a limit in the number of students per class. Regarding the academies, right? Similarly, they assume to be full in general. Logically, in this context that we are having right now, and you probably have observed that in the many promotions or marketing material that you probably receive, there are several academic institutes and so on, right, that are offering particular classes, right, given the fact that they not already have the limitation of space, right? So since there's, in this particular case, right, it was assumed that there was not going to be any more space, but there was the possibility of minor changes in prices, right? Realize that a 3% change in price, right, is very similar to the upper side of the estimated inflation rate, right? You know that we have an inflation target with a bandwidth that is between 1% and 3%, right? We are aiming to a 2%. So a 3% target that appears here, right? What they expected to adjust the prices based on inflation. And similarly, in the coming years, right, are going into inside the bandwidth in the middle of the target inflation rate. That's what it was expected to occur, right? Once again, I'm using here the information from prior year, right? The monthly data from prior year. And in this particular case, the seasonality is more drastic, right? It's more dramatic, right? Um, it's a little more clear that there are some months where people do prepare to get into the university, and there are other months, right, where you do not get a lot more, a significant number of students, right, because they have already uh, taken the examinations for the university as part of that structure, right? One of the questions that I usually had when I present this model is, and nobody's asking, is why I'm not using a subscribers model in this particular case for the school, for the students, right? Since it's something that it may appear a lot more similar to subscriber funds. The thing that have been observed when we try to analyze this by subscribers is that there is a lot of volatility regarding the payment for those subscribers, right? Remember what we just discussed on recurring revenue side? Um, the payment for the subscriber was assumed, or the revenue generation for the subscriber was assumed to be uh, immediately, right? That the customers were supposed to pay. What does appear here in the case of parents is that yes, you usually do keep the same students that you have in April until December. There are going to be some people who leave, obviously, very little people who usually travel or something like that happen. But the problem with that, in order to think about a subscriber scheme, is that parents do not pay on time, right? So usually this information, as I was mentioning, is both based on cash, right, collection, and what we are going to be getting in general in this particular scenario is that you are going to be better off using historical data of cash collection in order to come up with what's going to be expected as revenue in the coming um, in the coming months and then in the coming years, as has been forecasted over here, right? What's going to be the revenues overall. As you can realize, the numbers are more or less stable in general, with the expected growth rate of 3% that has been 3% and then 2% that has been included here. And for the addition, right, once again, it was only an estimation based on the number of students and based on the number of adjustment in price that you will expect, right? Nothing complicated over there. Okay, but from let's go here with the typical estimation that we're going to be having for all the other means, right? And we talked about this before, right? We should try to get this on a bottom-up approach, right? Which is the best way to try to estimate or forecast a financial statement of cash flow or information, right? Net cash flow that we're going to have. Give me 1 minute. Sorry, this, I don't know if it's not a code properly. If I think about it, fortunately, it's not, I guess the doctor says not something too complicated, but it's actually limiting my ability to speak fluently as I would expect to. Okay, from a personal standpoint, right? So once again, as I was trying to highlight when we discussed, you should expect to be capable of estimating correctly, right? The data on the number of personnel that you're going to have in the different instance. So if possible, right? We're going to do this in another exercise in 1 or 2 weeks, right? We are going to drill into the personnel tab, right, and figure out, okay, how many people do we have, right? And in order to come up with how many people we have in the manufacturing side of the business, how many people do we have in the administrative side of the business, how many people do we have in managerial positions, right? And based on that, and based on salary, you can assume and you can calculate correctly what's going to be the personnel tab, right? That's one of the topics I want to drill into the future. What you should consider in personnel, and I also already did a spoiler alert or spoiler, sorry, regarding stock compensation, right? The payment or the distribution of net income to workers, right? Some net income before taxes to workers as a whole. So, so in this particular case, when we are analyzing this from a personnel is not going to be analyzed bottom up, or at least is not being drilled to the micro level in this particular Excel, right? But if you analyze the personnel tab, what we have assumed here is a growth rate, right? Similar to the inflation rate that we have here on top also for prices, right? So even if you are growing, realize here that we are growing not only by 3%, right? We're growing by 3% plus the increase on 2%, right? That's a little bit higher than 5%, right? By even if that happens, personnel is not growing at the same rate, right? It's growing only by 3%, adjusting their salaries. So it means that as we assume over here, obviously I'm going to get to the same numbers, but as we assume over here, the personnel are becoming a lot more productive, right? So if we think about only teachers, for instance, right? What we are basically saying is that we are making these teachers, these professors, to teach to a higher number of students, right? We are capable of teaching a lot more classrooms, for instance, right? Or we are capable of filling all the classrooms with more students to the limit that we have in operational side of the business, right? This is basically what is mentioned here, right? And then it's making it grow at 2% as a whole. For the rent side of the business, right? From the rent side of the business, what we're going to have is that it's going to be growing at this 3% that I'm showing off over here, right? As a whole. And it's just going to be similar to the inflation rate that we already have discussed as part of the business, right? uh, for the property tax, right, and municipality tax as part of that, as I mentioned, is if it's possible, go to a bottom-up approach where you are capable of knowing what you expect to be these taxes, right, in real life for the company, right? So that's what we have tried to put down over here, right? What we should expect as taxes for the company, assuming that there are no more expansion, right, in facilities, as we discussed at the beginning when we did talk about revenue. Regarding the other items, right, as we talk about uh, uh, VAT, value-added taxes, IGB, and other taxes that you may have, right, we're making them grow similar to the economy, right? The sorry, it's taking a little bit harder than I expected. For the director piece, right, there's going to be director fees over here, right? That as we discussed, they're going to be constant over time, right? So I'm just going to be getting that constant, assuming that they have monthly meetings, right? And yes, they do have monthly meetings in this company, right? Because the directors not only advise on strategic items, but they also advise on several executive decisions for the company, right? But normally you will see that companies only have board of directors meeting every quarter, right? One every quarter, so 4 meetings in the whole year. In this particular case, it was monthly when I estimated this. Utilities, I have assumed that they are growing similar to the economy once again. And the fixed funds, right, these are usual expenses that the company had, right, as part of a typical overhead. And when we talk about this, right, you can think here about expenses such as leases for the managers, right, in general, their car leases on top of that, right, usually pairs that are related to uh, uh, payments to employees, right? Here I'm thinking about not salary related, right? We're talking about more of the typical sales meeting, right, or coordination meetings with teachers that are going to be regularly held as part of the typical structure, right? That's what fixed funds meant over here. So also the insurance part and all the other ones, right? We try to estimate this on a high level, right? And the supplier side also estimating them with a 3%. So all of these that I'm talking about, right, are just estimations in order to come out with the total numbers, right, from a macro level perspective, right, that we're going to be having over here in general. I'm sorry, but I think I'm gonna need to cut the class a little bit short with this sore throat. It's making me very difficult to continue speaking. Uh, so let me do this. Let me upload this to Blackboard, right? And uh, post later on some exercises on or no exercises. It's not an exercise to develop, but some case, right, that we discuss on top of this for everybody to go over it, right? And let me get back to you in during the week about it, right, through some announcements and figure out the best way to go over this on next Tuesday. Sorry about that. That is actually complicated to continue, and I don't to continue speaking at all. And that's why I had to cancel last class. I was hoping I was better, but it appears it isn't. So déjenme cambiar a español. Y como les decía, lamento probablemente tenga que cortar la clase un poco corta porque me está costando hablar bastante. No es esta dolencia, no, yo creí que estaba mucho mejor, pero parece que no calculé que fuera tan bravo. Como les digo, déjenme postear, primero voy a postear esto en Blackboard, voy a poner un caso adicional para que podamos discutirlo, y tengo que poner también las instrucciones para el trabajo final, que todavía falta bastante tiempo, no se preocupen por eso, entre los exámenes parciales que ya se vienen. 2 semanas, ya me llegó el aviso, me parece, por si acaso. Y voy a terminar de postear también algún ejercicio adicional para que podamos discutirlo mejor en la siguiente clase. Sorry about that. Sigo hablando en inglés. Disculpen, chicos, en verdad sí quiero que este seminario sea mejor, la primera vez que se dicta, en verdad, y no ha sido un inicio muy bueno de mi parte y me molesta bastante. Pero nada, a afrontar las cosas como vienen. Y nada, lo posteo ahora y déjenme saber si tienen alguna duda, pregunta y demás. Y ya no a recibir comentarios y sugerencias. Quiero meter el tema de casos, encontré un par, pero en verdad abarcan temas un poco más avanzados de lo que hemos hecho. Déjenme correr un poco en la siguiente clase y entramos a esos temas. ¿Sí? Creo que es lo mejor que podemos hacer para que esto sea más. ¿Sí? Pues nada, muchas gracias por ser comprensivos, todos los que están posteando y todos los que yo sé que también no están posteando, y juntémonos